Okay, good afternoon. Time for us to begin, and we will talk about Plato today. But before we do, just a small change I decided to do is not going to review these questions for the exam in the beginning of classes, but instead we'll put this on the video. Makes more sense this way, I guess. So the lecture videos will have all the answers for all the questions on the review, in case if you guys need to watch them again before the exam, you can do it, or it's better to do it as you go along. Hopefully that will work. Okay, anyway, today we will finally talk about Plato himself. Remember when we had talked about Socrates last time, I mentioned that all we know about Socrates, well, not all of it, but great majority of it comes from Plato. And again, Plato was one of those young people who followed Socrates on the streets of Athens. But it's very different from in the case of Plato, because what we know about Plato himself is a lot. He actually was very prolific writer. He has written a large number of dialogues. So we finally have somebody who we can read in the original and not rely on somebody else to talk about him. Now, how important Plato is? Well, this is two towering figures in philosophy. Plato and Aristotle. If you go to Rome, which is obviously not easy to do now, but hopefully when pandemic is over, it'll be possible again. If you go to Rome, to Vatican, which is in Rome, they have a famous Sistine Chapel. And one of the famous parts of Sistine Chapel is this fresco, which has Plato and Aristotle. So this would be Plato here. This is Plato. This is Aristotle. And Plato is pointing up into the sky, and Aristotle is kind of pointing towards the earth. So we will talk about Plato this week and about Aristotle next week. And like I said, they are both really the most important foundational stones in Western philosophy. You may say everything we did up until now was kind of building up to these two. And again, as interesting as Socrates is, since he has never written anything himself, we obviously can only rely on Plato and other sources to find out what did he even teach, and it may not really be true. Yes, Rome is a fantastic city. I would certainly recommend anybody who is able to go there to go, because it is amazing. What we have here from little kind of Venice, type of Venice in one of the casinos does not give you any representation, or Caesar's Palace doesn't give you any representation of how Rome itself is. There's kind of a Rome-ish type of cartoonish stuff, but not exactly the real deal. Okay, so few facts about Plato. This is his statue of him, which probably looks very close to how he did look in his older years. Plato was born 428 or 427 BCE. Joined Socrates probably when he was around 20 or so years old, so 8-9 years before Socrates' death. Remember, Socrates was killed in 399, right? So when that happened, how old was Plato? Can you figure it out? And remember, we are counting backwards, right? So if you look at the date when he was born, and you look at the date when Socrates was executed, how many years passed? Yeah, roughly 29, 28, 29, depending on like when you count his year of birth. Again, it's like not exactly. Some sources say for 27, some for 28. But something like that. So he was still relatively young man, and he spent his entire 20s following Socrates around. He loved him greatly. And Plato himself, unlike Socrates, comes from a very noble family. Um, his mother is related to Solon, who is like this very, what do you call it, almost myth-like figure in Greek history. He was one of the lawgivers who lived about 200 years, 150 years or something, prior to Socrates, but to Plato, and supposedly laid the foundation of the Athenian democracy and the Athenian Republic. So, in other words, Plato comes from a very, very noble, wealthy heritage. He was groomed to become a political leader, but after he followed Socrates, he decided to become philosopher instead. After Socrates was executed, he was naturally very upset, and as far as we know, he left Athens and traveled for a few years around the Greek world, even went to Elia. So remember we talked about the Eleatics, so he actually got familiar with them. He got familiar with the Eleatic ideas, to Parmenides in particular. He also got acquainted with Pythagoreans. Remember the Pythagoreans, the ideas about transmigration of the soul, the ideas about numbers as the foundation of reality. All of this comes from the sources already after the death of Socrates. So that is present in Plato's work, and it's not really Socratic. Socrates himself probably never talked about any of this, but it was already Plato's own contribution. And then when he came back to Athens, he founded the Academy. Today we use the word academy all the time. You say, oh, he's an academic, it's an academy. Now this is where this word actually comes from. Plato found his school in the garden dedicated to Greek hero Academius, and that's why it was known as academy. So kind of coincidentally, but because it was known as academy and it was such a well-known institution of learning for several hundred years, in fact, it existed there in Athens and then it was closed down already during the Roman Empire becoming prominent and by the Romans. So for this reason, today we still use this as a term to refer to somebody who is doing academic work. Finally, he died around 348, 347, which would mean about 80 years. He was about 80 years old. So this is just briefly about his life. Now, like I said, we have actually quite a lot of his actual work. And he is the first one of all the philosophers we talked so far about, whose body of work, pretty much all of his work, as far as we know, we actually have. We have 42 dialogues. Some of them actually there's questions whether they even belong to him or were written later, but great majority of them are definitely by Plato. We have 13 letters, which again there are questions whether he actually wrote those letters, but there's good evidence that he may have. And one collection of sayings. So this is a rather large amount of work. His complete works can be purchased if you want, and it is quite a thick book. But as far as we know, this is everything he wrote, and it's complete. Now, most of his dialogues, early dialogues, remember we talked about it last time, early dialogues are probably mostly based on the actual teachings of Socrates, and then he started developing his own philosophy, still talking about using Socrates in his dialogues as a mouthpiece, but that already is probably just, for his own philosophy. Early dialogues typically end in aporia. Aporia meaning the dead end. The oldest surviving work of his, which we actually have, the original manuscript, is 9th century. So you may wonder, how then do we know it's written by him? And how do we actually, why don't we have the earlier work? Well, just to explain to you a little bit how it actually worked back then, because maybe interesting for you to know. So Plato himself was writing this probably on a papyrus or some other material, and he created probably like one copy, right? Then that one copy was copied multiple number of times during his lifetime, and probably was used by various scholars in Athens and maybe even outside Athens. Then there are copies made of these works in turn, right? Then there were copies made of these copies. So the earliest actual works we have is a couple of 100 years after he died, and they are like probably copies of copies, and they are not even complete. We have just chunks here and there, like little chunks. But they were also copied, and those copies were still copied. Most of it is lost, but there's just two good quality original manuscripts which we usually use now to learn about his work, and those are Parisianus and Bodleianus. That's how they are known, like kind of Latinized names. Why? Because one of them is in Paris and it's called Parisianus, and the other one is in Oxford in Bodleian Library. That's why it's called Bodleianus. So this is kind of how it all looks like. This is the 3rd century papyrus which we have. It's a chunk of one of his dialogues called Phaedo. 3rd century BC, meaning it must have been written around, I don't know, 250 BC or thereabouts. Roughly 100 years after he died. So it obviously is not his handwriting. And we only have this little chunk. You see, this is the chunk we have. It has holes in it. Why? Because it's been 2,300 years. You know, paper doesn't last very much. And as careful as they must have handled it, it still has deteriorated somewhat. This is a transcription of what it says. Note, there's one interesting thing. I think I mentioned it before. They did not make any breaks between words. It's like one long word. Everything is like this one long word. It also is all in capital letters. And it is, of course, in ancient Greek. Now, the most recent, like I said, copy, more complete copy we have, Bodleianus, which is in Oxford Library, is copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. We don't know how many times they were copying it, but nonetheless, note that this highlighted portion here, that's exactly the same words as we see here. So, since this one is complete, we can compare it and see, well, that part is exactly the same, so the rest of it must be the same too. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to be sure whether or not somebody has done something to, you know, adjust it or whatever. Now, like I said, this one is 895 AD, already our time. So that's about what? We are in 2021, so 1,126 years ago. That's how long ago it was written. But note that it also is about 1,300 years after Plato. So 1,300 years have passed. They made this copy from some other copy, and now another 1,126 years have passed, and we have this copy. That's how we actually know his work. It has obvious problems because sometimes some parts maybe hard to read. This is all handwritten, obviously, they were not printing it. And because it's a copy of a copy of a copy, there's a possibility now and then some scholar made a mistake while copying it by hand, because the way they did it, they would look at the whatever they had, and then they would just write it down, right? So naturally there's possibility of some mistakes, but since we have two pretty good copies and a couple of other ones which are not as good but still decent, and we have a whole bunch of these little chunks coming back to the 3rd century, we kind of know more or less that they are all authentic and that they generally are good. Now and then we have some disagreements about that. So this is how it would look now. So we have it published in Ancient Greek. This is from 1995 edition. And this is the English translation. So if you read any of the Plato, that obviously would be in English translation going from this Ancient Greek, which is, again, note that unlike the original, the way Plato was writing it, is not capital letters and does have breaks between words. But other than that, it is the same text. If you look carefully, you will see that there's exactly the same words there. And this is what they mean. This is the small fraction of the work. They are all obviously translated into English now, multiple number of times. So there are people who actually professionally learn Ancient Greek and work with those manuscripts and compare them and dedicate their life to this. Okay, now again, Socrates, as far as we know, was mainly concerned with ethical questions. He tried to figure out those definitions, just like we talked about last time. What is justice? What is courage? And usually his dialogue do not end with any kind of resolution. Plato himself tried to take it one step further and present the whole system. For this reason, we actually call this period in philosophy systematic period. Why? Because both Plato and Aristotle tried to give a complete system explaining everything and not just, raising questions, but tried to give answers to those questions. Okay, so mature Plato as he was already after the death of Socrates, rejects, first of all, the same things as Socrates rejected. He rejects this traditional approach of Homer and Hesiod. Remember the traditional approach, Homer and Hesiod, warrior hero, all this kind of multiple gods constantly fighting with each other and so on. He rejects all that. He also rejects relativism of the sophists, again, just like Socrates, known as new learning. And that is a little bit more like our modern approach. So again, remember what the sophists, the Protagoras in particular, was saying. What is his famous saying? Can somebody remember that? Yes, exactly. Man is the measure of all things, of those that are what they are, of those that are not that they are not. So basically, again, it's kind of somewhat of a more modern outlook when we say it's different from culture to culture. There is no one uniform approach, but Plato rejects that. However, he also not rejects Socrates, but he definitely moves away from Socrates in at least one important sense. Socrates thought that knowledge by itself is enough. If you know what the good is, you should be able to be a good person. He thought that people who are evil are just ignorant. They just don't know what good is. Now, you guys probably can figure out what the problem with that is. Does it make sense to you? Does it? So again, to repeat it, people who are evil just don't know what the good is. That's why they're evil. If they knew what the good is, if you explain it to them, they would not be evil. Does it make sense? No, there seemed to be a problem with that. And as much as Socrates was saying that, qualified it by just like they just have to be better, explained better. Nonetheless, it seems to us that there is a problem with that, and this is what Plato thought too. He thought that doesn't seem right. There should be at least something more than just knowledge which makes us good people. Some people definitely may know what the good is, but nonetheless do evil things, or at least things which may not necessarily be considered evil, but just wrong, just something which is making them not as good of a human beings, or at least not as successful as they themselves would like to be. So he kind of rejected Socrates in that sense, and he moved on, and he tried to explain it deeper and deeper. Again, remember, one important difference there also is Socrates was a simple guy. He was just, your average Joe. He was wandering the streets of Athens barefoot, dressed in shabby clothes, and trying to, use his common sense to talk to people. He also was saying he doesn't know anything himself. That's one of the important parts of his philosophy. Now, Plato, on the other hand, is not like that at all. He comes from a noble family. He got probably a very good education. He was supposed to be a politician. He had plenty of money. He certainly didn't need to work for a living. So he is a different person overall. And for this reason, his approach is also different. Now, Republic, that's one of the grandest work by Plato. It's like a collection of dialogues which is called books, even though they are not books in the sense I guess we would call it today, because they're not that long. They're more like chapters rather than books. Nonetheless, it is fairly long and fairly thorough. Some of the quotes from it are in your book in the chapter you were supposed to read for today. If you didn't read the entire thing yet, I hope you do it by Wednesday, because it is quite interesting, but obviously there's not very much. There's just a little bit. And we already talked about Republic last time, because we started with it. The first book in the Republic, the first dialogue there, is probably goes back to Socrates himself, because it's very Socratic in essence. It ends with kind of not really a solution. Remember what happened there? Thrasymachus has attacked Socrates in a sense and told him all this talk about justice. This is all nonsense. Justice is just a way for powerful people to get us to do what they want. If we are being just, all we do is just essentially serve them, because they want us to be just. Of course they want us to be just. The understanding there is that being just is obviously to follow the law, right? But who gives the law? Politicians, which is still as true today as it was true in Athens. And even though they had a democracy and we have a democracy, but even today there are plenty of people who are saying, all these politicians, they're all corrupt. So whatever laws they pass, it's just to enrich themselves and to keep themselves in power and so on. So plenty of people today mistrust democracy, and even more people back then mistrusted democracy and mistrusted any kind of authority, and certainly mistrusted kings and all sorts of authoritarian rulers, and there were plenty of those in Greek world too. So this is kind of Thrasymachus' point of view. And remember, even Socrates rejected it. But when Republic moves on into the second book, there's even more interesting discussion which begins, and this is where Plato kind of lays out his own ideas. Now, what happens there? After Socrates more or less defeated Thrasymachus, but in a more of a dialectical sense. Remember, he caught him in a contradiction, asking, well, how about if those in power pass the laws which are not in their interest? Can't they make a mistake? And so then following those laws would not be serving their interest. But that seems like a trickery more than anything. And then eventually he does bring one good argument. He says, well, how about gang of criminals of some sort? Can they achieve anything if they're being unjust? And Obviously, the answer is no. If they have been unjust towards each other, they will never be able to accomplish anything. They have to be just at least towards each other. But there's still hanging question about what exactly is justice. And two other heroes of this dialogue, Glaucon Ademontos, who, by the way, named, I don't know accidentally or not, after the brothers of Plato himself, even though in the book he never calls them their brothers, his brothers, but nonetheless, those are the names of his brothers. They interrupt and talk to Socrates in a more friendly way than Thrasymachus. And they tell him this. They say, okay, well, we do kind of understand where you're coming from. Justice is necessary, but why do you think that it is actually good for people who are being just other than to put up a show? Remember the example we also mentioned there about the ring of judges. So they tell him there are three types of good things. Now, one type of a good thing is the thing which is good for their own sake, like enjoying the sunset. The other type is good for their own sake and for their consequences. Things like knowledge or health. So what exactly are they talking about? Well, they mean that if you enjoy the sunset, right, you're enjoying it, but there's really no good consequences for you in the future. It's just pleasant while it lasts, but next day it doesn't leave anything for you. Now, when you enjoy things like knowledge and health, for example, when you study and you enjoy the process of learning new things, or when you exercise or whatever and you actually are getting healthier, not only the process is enjoyable, but it also gives you good consequences, right? So in the future, you are still able to enjoy good health and knowledge. It's not just in the moment when you are learning things. And then there are a third type of things, which is something we actually don't enjoy in the first place, but it has good consequences nonetheless. So example would be going to a dentist, right? Who enjoys going to a dentist? What crazy person enjoys that? I don't know. If there are such people, they're weird. Most people don't enjoy it. So, but it does have good consequences, right? That's why we go. Because once you go to a dentist and go through this suffering, you actually avoid bigger suffering in the future. You get healthy teeth. And there are things like that. So note that this is the three distinct types of things. One of them is enjoyable but no good consequences. The other one is enjoyable and has good consequences. And the third one is not enjoyable but has good consequences. So Glaucon and Ademontos tell Socrates that justice, they think, is number 3. So nobody really enjoys being just. But why do you do it? For good consequences. Because if other people see you as just, they actually treat you nicely. So this is kind of this rather modern idea too, that we as a society follow these certain rules, not because we necessarily enjoy them ourselves, but because we think that if other people follow them, we will benefit, right? So, example being, we don't steal anything. Why don't we steal anything? Well, because even though we would probably like to have all these nice things other people have, but if we start stealing and other people start stealing from us, we may end up with nothing, right? There's going to be some clever people who are even more clever than you, and they will steal everything from you. So that will be hell. And to avoid this bad consequence, we kind of give up on stealing and say, okay, even though I would like to steal a bunch of stuff, but I'm not going to do that because I don't want other people to do it. So this is their point, right? They're saying people don't really enjoy justice. Who in their right mind would enjoy justice? If people could, just like the Ring of Judges story, they would do all these bad things, but nonetheless, it pays to be just. It pays for your reputation when other people think you are just, and so for this reason, we are just. Number 3, But Socrates, who is again in this case already a mouthpiece for Plato himself, answers that no, actually justice is number two. Justice is good in itself and good for its consequences. And the whole Republic is more or less his attempt to prove it, to show why does he think this is the case. Why is justice in itself already such a good thing? So the Judges of Lydia story, the Ring of Judges, that's part of this conversation. Even if you are unjust but never caught, that still is not very good for you. Why exactly not? Now this is kind of a quote there. Ademontos, one of them, is telling him, so please don't just demonstrate to us by argument that justice is something more powerful than injustice. Tell us the effect each one of them has just by itself on the person possessing it, whether or not gods and men know about it, the effect which makes one of them good and the other bad. So suppose somebody, they say, is just person, but nobody knows he is just, and people actually think he is unjust. Not only they think he is unjust, they punish him, and he dies a painful death, but he was just his entire life. So they're saying, how is it any benefit to him then? Now this is how Plato starts to answer this. It is to him connected to our soul. Remember, psyche, that's a Greek for the soul, and Plato is saying our soul has three parts. Three parts of the soul. The soul has a rational part, and that would be our reason. It also has what he calls a spirited part. What is a spirited part? It's kind of like a passional, emotional side. The side which typically throws us into anger, ambition, courage, and pride. When we feel these emotions, that means our spirited part is waking up. Note that it is different from reason, right? Reason sometimes kind of pulls it back, and sometimes reason doesn't. So, for example, take anger. You can get angry about things even if it's not good for you. So your reason would be telling you, you probably shouldn't be angry now. It's not good. But you're not listening to your reason, right? You're still angry. And it happens all the time. He also saying we have what he calls a petitive part. And that is the part which has all these bodily desires. Desire for food, drink, sex, and so on. And that part also kind of is important because even though it's different from both spirited and rational part, but nonetheless it has its own demands. We want tasty food. We want nice drinks. And of course, being human being, at least most of us do enjoy having sexual relations. So all of this comes from the body, and this is the third part. He has a very good example in one of the dialects called Phaedrus, a chariot example. The chariot is this traditional kind of Greek carriage where you have two horses and a rider, the person who is sitting there with these two horses. So he compares our soul to a chariot. He's saying reason is the driver. Reason is the person in charge. Whoever is in charge there of the chariot would be comparable to reason. And spirit and appetites are two horses, which kind of carry that whole chariot forward. Spirit is the more obedient horse, the one which kind of listens to the driver a little bit better, but nonetheless not always. And appetites is disobedient, the wild horse. So all these desires we have for sex and food and drinks and so on, bodily desires, they're harder to control for us. So this is how we are, right? We don't always actually listen to our reason. So an example in life would be, suppose you want to drink. Now your appetitive part would be the one who is telling you, you should drink. You should drink. You want to drink? Go ahead, drink. Now reason may tell you that it's not a good idea for whatever reason. So, for example, if you are driving, right? You are the only driver of your car, and you are in a bar somewhere, and your friends are telling you, "Oh, let's have a drink. That's no big deal." Now, your petitive part would be telling you, "Yeah, sure, it's no big deal. Just have a drink. What's the big deal?" Your reason will be telling you, "Hey, I have to drive back, and like, even a little bit of a drink, it may not be such a great idea, especially if I get carried away." What would be your spirited part? Your spirited part would obviously be more of an emotional approach. Something like, it may tell you, to hell with it, just drink it anyway, or whatever. So this is how we typically work. And this is more realistic than, I guess, Socratic approach. So why is he even telling this? We will know in a moment. Let's do a little poll. Let's see what you guys think. In particular, for each one of you, which part of your soul do you think controls most of the time? Not all the time, obviously, because obviously for all of us, all three are in play, but like most of the time. Honestly, what do you think? Let's do a little poll here. So options A, B, C. A, reason, B, spirit, and C, appetite. There's still few people who didn't vote. I don't know if they're not listening or something. Or just cannot decide. Well, obviously there's no like grade for it, so you can just honestly answer what you think. Doesn't really matter one way or the other. Okay, let's tally up and see what you guys think. Okay, from people who voted, it's almost an even split, but in the last moment one more person went for reason. So reason got slightly more. Well, to be honest, I remember myself when I was like in my 20s, I would suggest that for at least great majority of people, these two are probably the main drivers. As you get older, reason takes over, but the younger you are, the more of a hold these two have. And for some people, spirit like pretty much drives throughout their entire life. But it is again dependent on the situation. Which one is primary is hard to say. Naturally, everybody is driven by all three. But he actually is not saying it just for fun. He has a very good explanation why it is important. So based on these three kind of drives we all have, he also distinguishes four primary moral virtues, which are similar to what we heard before. They are kind of traditional Greek ones, but he explains them in terms of this three-part psychology. Spirit resembles carefree people. Well, not necessarily. Good example of what spirit is like is every time you're carried by emotion, say when you get angry, right, or something like that. Very often, if not always, it's not a good idea. So, for example, yelling at your parents or somebody, even if they do something which annoys you, probably doesn't serve you very well. As a result, they get even more mad at you and so on. But you don't care, right? It's just so outrageous what they did. I don't know, like took away my car when I wanted to go to the party. And you can't help it. And when you're young, you don't even care. As you get older, you start thinking a little more about what's the consequence of me being angry now. Maybe it makes more sense for me to, just swallow it kind of and say, okay, whatever. And then that will be more beneficial. But that's already when your reason starts talking. But when you're young, you're not really listening to that very much. You just get carried away with this emotion more often. And some people, even when they're old, don't listen to that. Yeah, so that would be a spirit. So this is kind of like, note that it is very different from appetite, because your appetite is, again, that's something which drives you just towards stuff like food, sex, drink, and so on. It's just something which just creates these bodily desires. Naturally, it's not your bodily desire to get angry at your parents when they didn't let you go to a party. That's just something that you do. But note that both of them are obviously, again, different from reason. Because reason is always this cool voice in your head, which just tells you, maybe it's not a good idea. And you sometimes do listen to your reason, but very often you do not. Okay, anyway. So based on that, the 4 virtues would be, well, first of all, obviously wisdom. What is wisdom? Wisdom is when reason is in control. So that chariot, right? Reason is the driver. When the driver is in control and not the horses, that's when you are wise. That's when you have wisdom. The person who has wisdom will have his horses under control. The person who doesn't have wisdom will have these horses carry the chariot away by themselves. Get carried away with either his anger or his desire for sexual pleasures or his desire for some other bodily pleasures or something like that. Now, how about courage? What is courage? Well, courage is actually when spirited part is subordinated to the counsel of reason, right? And you can actually do that. And what's what we mean when we say somebody is courageous? What do courageous people do? For example, in a battle, right? Now, in a battle, you can be brave and courageous when you actually do things which may harm you. And even though these things could harm you, you nonetheless do them. That typically applies to military, first of all. But it may apply to all the rest of us when we have the situations when you have to show courage, right? I don't know. Suppose a criminal attacks other person and you are defending that other person. It's dangerous for you, but you are showing courage. What does it mean? It means you are still driven by wisdom rather than by your feelings. But nonetheless, it is your spirited part which is active here. Why? Well, typically, in order for you to fight, you do have to get angry. You do have to have this kind of emotional sway. It's not just pure reason which tells you you should fight, you should defend this person. Because there's naturally, especially in a battle, right? When soldiers fight in a battle, can you say they just listening to their reason? No, they probably have these feelings about their country, freedom, whatever else they want to defend. So when this is actually driven by wisdom, that would be courage. Otherwise, that would be just some sort of stupidity. Stupid, like you can compare that to, let's say, whatever criminal is doing. Sometimes criminal has this daring act when he, robs a bank. Would we say he shows courage? Probably not. It seems like courage is too nice. He's definitely being like, in some sense, brave, but not in a good way. So that's not as much courage as just some sort of a cockiness, or I don't know, whatever it is. And then there's self-discipline, or the book calls it temperance. Well, it doesn't matter because it's a Greek word, right? Which way you translate it, temperance or self-discipline. Now that is when your appetitive part is subordinated to your reason and to your spirited part. Your reason first of all. So again, you don't just follow your bodily desires. You don't just have sex because you feel like you should have sex. You ask yourself, what will be the consequences of that? Is it even a good idea? Or maybe it's not a good idea. Like, for example, you can ask yourself, do I really want to be with this person? Now, naturally, there may be a situation when you can take advantage of somebody, or not even take advantage, but you can see that there is a possibility of two people having sex, but then you can ask yourself, do I want to be with this person for at least long enough period of time, or is it just like one day kind of thing and then tomorrow I will regret it, right? So in that case, you again should listen to your reason, and that would be when your wisdom is taking part. But nonetheless, we all obviously are human, so we do follow this appetitive part periodically. However, as long as it is under the control of wisdom and courage, that would be self-disciplined behavior. And finally, what is justice? Now, his answer, what justice is when all these other elements are in correct balance. That is what it is. When all of this is in correct balance, when everything is subordinated to your wisdom, that is justice. And you may wonder, like, wait a minute. Isn't it kind of like some sort of psychology here? How is that justice? That's not exactly how we typically think about justice, right? When people demand justice, they don't say they want their courage and self-discipline be subordinated to their reason. Or do they? He has an interesting explanation about that, and this is how it works in the Republic, how it develops. So first of all, he talks about what a good action would be. Good action tends to subdue the brutish parts of our nature to the human, perhaps I should rather say divine, in us. So not everything we want to do, we should do. And our wisdom should actually tell us and distinguish which things we should do or not. Whereas evil actions would be enslaving our humanity to the savagery of the beast, acting like a beast. And the sweetest will belong to the part of the soul whereby we gain understanding and knowledge, and the man in whom that part predominates will have the most pleasant life. Okay, but still, how does this all work? So he actually does say that desire for luxury, wealth, and so on, just like for Socrates, is bad. But nonetheless, why do people still get corrupt? Why do they do all these things? Well, it also is worth remembering what we talked about last time. Remember when we talked about why exactly, like I gave one example, why this kind of free market type approach, the approach where let the best man win, is not really a good idea. What did I say? Do you guys remember? What example did I present? So when we talked about the sophists, and some of them were suggesting, just like today you hear many people are suggesting, well, hey, everybody has chance at success, right? So let the better ones succeed, and the ones which are can't succeed, it's their own fault. It's their own fault. So people who are on welfare, for example, or especially who have criminal record, well, they deserve it because they are just this kind of losers. And people who are millionaires, they deserve that because they are just very hardworking. So do you guys see, do you remember what I was talking about last time? What, before last time actually, that was like last Monday. Well, I don't know, does it? But there is another problem nonetheless, the one which I mentioned last time. So even if you assume that being successful financially is a good thing, and then you're saying that people who deserve it do get financially successful. What's the problem with this approach? Why can't we just measure everybody by their success? Okay, I don't know if you guys were not listening or just forgot about it. Okay, let me talk about it again then. Because we don't start from the same position. Remember, when you are born, are you making any decisions? Are you responsible for yourself? Do you choose who to be born? Do you like sit somewhere in the sky and decide, I want to be born a rich man. My parents should be rich. We'll live in Beverly Hills. No, you can't choose that, right? You're born in particular circumstances which are outside of your control. Not only that, after you're born, you have no control for the first year, second year, third year, fourth year, fifth year, sixth year of your life. At which point do you get any kind of control? Probably when you're like 13 or 14. And even that is very limited because you still don't have that much of a right. But by then your life already set on a particular course. If your daddy is a billionaire and he pays for your education and you are in the best private school and you live in Beverly Hills, you're probably okay. What about if you have parents who are drug addicts and you live in a crack house? But if we're going to hold everybody responsible, shouldn't we take that into consideration? Shouldn't it matter then? So this is exactly where Plato also comes in, because he realized that too. That who we are in life is determined when we are born by the circumstances which are completely outside of our control. So the whole Republic is also an attempt, for the first time probably in history, to figure out how do you set up a society so that would not happen. And by that, I mean the situation when you have no control. So that everybody would have more or less equal chance. And then if you give everybody an equal chance at success, then some people will do better and other people will not. But that already is genetics, right? They didn't have the word genetics, but that's what we would say today. Some people are smarter than others, some people are stronger than others, and so on. So then it kind of becomes more fair, because even though we don't choose that either, but at least in that case, you can say, well, if he worked harder, jumped higher, and so on, then he would have had more in life. And that you can even say is kind of fair, because yeah, people are different, but the ones who are able to contribute more to the society should have more in return. But if you don't have even the fair start, if when you are born you don't have an equal chance with everybody else, then how the hell are you supposed to be held accountable? That just seemed blatantly unfair, and there's no justice in that for sure. What kind of justice is that when we look at two people, right? John and Peter or whatever. John is born to the parents who live in a ghetto. He lives in this really horrible neighborhood. His friends from the childhood are all gangsters. So he gets enrolled in a gang because that's, the only thing in his neighborhood. He goes to the horrible public school where teachers don't even teach. And so then where do you think he will end up? What will it take for him to enroll in a university and get a degree? It's probably impossible for him, no matter how smart he is and how strong he is. If he is very smart and strong, what will happen? He'll probably be a very good gangster. He'll rob banks very well. But that's the road he is set to follow. And look, this other guy, let's say his father is a billionaire, he takes him to they live in a nice neighborhood, he takes him to the best private school, and so then he of course enrolls in the best university. And remember this scandal recently when they paid even millions of dollars as bribes to have their children in those universities. Well, how many people in America can afford that? Well, some people can. So naturally it came out in this case. How many cases it may not come out? And that just shows you that obviously you can't judge. And then these two people, when they're 30 years old, you can say, oh, look at him, he's a complete loser, he's in jail. And that guy, he is like president of the company, so he must have worked very hard. Well, you bet he worked hard, but he already got all of this set up by his parents. Anyway, so justice, according to Plato, is health and well-being of the soul, but it can be compared to the society in a sense that it also similarly health and well-being of the society. When you look at the society as a whole, you see justice in the same sense as when you look at the soul. So remember, we just talked about the soul, what the justice is in the soul, this balance, when all the parts are in balance. So Plato was saying similarly in a state. Just like an individual, when reason rules and controls the spirit and the appetites, similarly in society, the individuals perform their best when everyone does what they are capable of doing, their best job. So his political theory is built on that. He goes quite a bit further and he tries to imagine this ideal society, which may look very weird to us because his republic is definitely strange. So first of all, he starts by saying, well, there got to be a division of labor. Why? Well, because some people are better at certain things and other people are better at other things, right? There are people who are more thinkers, there are people who are more men of action, and there are people who are just, plain ordinary folks who are not that good at any of these things, but they just work hard. And so based on that, you already have this division there. So he's saying some people should definitely be politicians, they should rule the state. And he actually is not a huge friend of democracy because he thinks that some people are better at ruling than others. So for this reason, he doesn't think that everybody should rule. Now, in the same time, there also are two other types of people. One of them he calls producers or laborers. This is what we may call ordinary folks. This is people who do all the work, and by the way, it's not just manual work. He would put here also all sorts of artists and judges and, I don't know, lawyers and doctors and everybody who does work. That would be workers or producers. Then there are what he calls guardians of two types. Guardians could be auxiliaries or warriors, and those are police, military, and some sort of government officials. And there are proper guardians who are like rulers, and rulers would be the ones who are in charge. So the way he thought it was going to work is full social mobility, meaning when children are born, they are all completely equal, and then those guardians actually look at them and decide what would be the best future for them. Some of them are better off as ordinary folks, just producers. Some of them are better off as warriors. They have this more of a military spirit. And the ones who are better off as warriors may also be wise enough to eventually become rulers. And his rulers, by the way, are the ones who were warriors for a certain period of time, showed that they are not only brave and courageous, but also wise, and for this reason, select few of them become the rulers and control the whole thing. And note that that also is how the soul works. So this is the appetitive part. The workers are the appetitive part. The workers are the ones who have this kind of bodily desires for food, drink, and sex. Now, this is a spirited part, the warriors. That's the police, military, and so on, the spirited part, which are kind of using their anger, but in a good way, wisely, towards enemies of the state, first of all, because the army defends you from other states, the ones who want to take away your freedom. And also like some sort of police function against people amongst those producers who maybe start breaking rules and acting unjustly towards others. So that would be what auxiliaries do. And finally, the guardians, like I said, this is like reason, right? That's what reason does. It controls the whole thing. That's your people in charge. Now, few things he introduces only amongst guardians. One of them, it's like communism. He says they should not have property. They should not have any property, personal property at all. Whatever they have, they should have in common. So they wouldn't have any personal houses. They would live in some sort of accommodation, but that's like shared accommodation. They would not have any personal possessions, although they probably would have some clothes and, I don't know, some weapons, but they would be, again, kind of like the same for everyone. Note that, again, this is just for the guardians. The workers, the regular folks, don't have to do that. But the guardians do. Also, funny enough, he thinks they should have common wives. He thinks they should not have family and common children. So, in other words, even though they obviously have sex, but they have sex with random women, or I'm guessing by agreement, he doesn't really specify that. But actually, at one point he's saying that it could be chosen by random draw or something. Yeah, but nonetheless, different women. And the children, as soon as they are born, are taken away. Now, interesting. Why do you think he does that? What kind of problem he's trying to solve there? Exactly. Just the problem I mentioned 2 minutes ago. That's the problem. Because note that no matter how fair you try to make the society, there's going to be difference in parents. Different parents, based on their own ability, will be in different position. Some of them may be rulers of the state. Some of them may be again on the bottom. And if children are not taken away from them, it can't help but influence the beginning of their life. Because the parents who have more success in life obviously are in better position to give their children better future. And so he's trying to solve this problem by, first of all, taking away the children as soon as they're born and kind of having them grow up together in some sort of a camp. And the other problem he's trying to solve, the property. That's why he wants to take away the property, because again, he thinks that if some people have more than others, that again will create tension. And even though he only does it for the guardians, but nonetheless, he's trying to address these two problems, so that children would all have equal start and the guardians would not be jealous of each other and go after the money. Because note that guardians have weapons, they are the ones in charge. So yes, that's how he's trying to resolve that. Couple of other interesting things about his ideas. He also has a role for women. This is kind of a very progressive for the time, even though there are some... What about the wives? Well, what about the wives? Wives, again, are just women who have sex with this man. They don't have regular families, right? So I call them wives, you can call them wives, but they are not like really wed. It's selected by random draw, or whatever other way. They have sex, they have a child is immediately taken away, and the woman moves on to another guy, right? He did not spell out all the details, obviously, so you may wonder, is the woman even going to want to do that? He never goes there. Obviously, there are a lot of problems with the whole thing, because taking children away, how many women will even allow that, and so on. Well, he is just trying to set up this kind of ideal society. He's not saying that's actually what's going to happen, right? It's, you may say, more or less a fairy tale, a story about this kind of ideal society, which, as he will say later, doesn't necessarily exist anywhere and may not even necessarily exist anywhere. Nonetheless, this is an attempt to solve this problem of unequal starting point. And another thing he's saying, women actually don't have to be like loyal wives or whatever. They can also be guardians and warriors. Only the ones who are capable now. So in general, he kind of says, yeah, it's obvious women are not as strong as men, at least most of them. Which, many feminists have a problem with this. Nonetheless, for the period of time we're talking about, 2400 years ago, that was very progressive to even suggest that women don't have to sit at home and cook dinner. Women can also be guardians and can also be rulers, but at least the ones of them who are strong enough to do that. So if a little girl seems like she is strong enough to be a guardian or a warrior, yes, she should be. There should not be any reason to say, oh, you're a woman, why do you want to be a guardian? You can be a guardian, no problemo. So that was rather progressive too. Okay, so who is going to be those rulers? He actually say they should be philosophers. The philosopher kings. This is the quote. He's saying, unless either philosophers become kings in their countries, or those who are now called kings and rulers come to be sufficiently inspired, and a genuine desire for wisdom. Unless, that is to say, political power and philosophy meet together, there can be no rest from troubles. For states, nor yet, as I believe, for all mankind. Nor can this commonwealth, which we have imagined, ever till then see the light of day and grow to its full stature. Well, you may wonder, wait a minute, it's like he did say that guardians in charge come from warriors. Yeah, they come from warriors, and they also are philosophers. So those are those among warriors who kind of, through education and through their bravery, also show that they can be philosophers. Now, we'll talk a little more about what specifically he meant by philosophers and what philosophers were supposed to do next time. But the idea is those rulers should be philosophers in that they should be wise. They should be people who not just care about bodily things such as wealth and power. In fact, they shouldn't care about it at all, because the philosophers do not care about wealth and power. How are female philosophers viewed? Well, again, note that since he says that women, if they are capable, can be whoever they want to be, then naturally some of them could also be philosophers. There is no restriction for that. So he never tried that in real life, right? He never had a state set up like this, so we don't know if it would work or not. But nonetheless, he in his work is saying that if women show themselves capable, they can be rulers. So they can be philosophers too. The book gives quite a bit of attention to this issue. Note that it actually notes their quote from Plato's mother. She apparently wrote some stuff, and some other women philosophers of the period. So if you're interested, read the book. It does go into some detail. Note that for many reasons, most female philosophers of the period are not very well known to us, because even though we today may consider it to be equally interesting and important, people at the time didn't. So they did in Greek society, in Athens, in classical Athens, women generally were considered inferior to men, and they were considered more of somebody who works in the house and does all the homework. So for this reason, even those of them who were trying to be philosophers and were doing some work in that field, they were not really followed that much, and for this reason their work mostly is lost, and we don't even have that much of it, and it didn't have as much of an impact. So today we mainly talk about men like Plato, Aristotle, and so on, who had a huge impact because many other people were interested in their ideas. So that's kind of important to understand. It's not that we don't want to know more about female philosophers, but we do have to respect the fact that unfortunately they were not very influential. Okay. So, philosopher kings. Note that the book again does talk about how there are different theories of morality. There is an instrumental theory of morality, of which we did talk a little bit last time. This is what Glaucon and Ademontos were suggesting. Instrumental theory of morality is to say that a moral position, that right and wrong, must be determined by the consequences. Right? So if we want to figure out whether murder is wrong, we should see whether the consequences of people murdering each other is desirable. And if we say, yeah, it's wonderful when people murder each other, it's just works so well, then we should say it's moral. But if we think, no, that doesn't look good to us, probably people shouldn't murder each other, then based on that we can say it's immoral. So what is moral determined by the consequences. Now there's another approach, and that is actually what Plato has. It's a functional theory of morality. It's a moral position that right and wrong can be understood only in terms of their effect on anything's natural function. So if we say that there's a natural function of man, and if we want to figure out what is moral, we should look at man and figure out what exactly damages that. What is unnatural for us? And for this reason, this is kind of functional approach. Note that it is different from just saying we're looking at the consequences. In this case, we're looking not at the consequences of actions themselves, but more of a what kind of creatures human beings are and what would specifically make them happy. And this is what exactly Plato is doing. So in this case, it can be explained like happiness depends on conformity of our nature to our nature as active beings. What our nature is, we should live according to our nature. Not that it assumes that there is actually a human nature. Does such community as Plato described exist on earth? He actually raises this question, and this is what he says. No, but perhaps there is a pattern set up in heavens for one who desires to see it, and seeing it to found oneself, one in himself. But whether it exists anywhere or ever will exist is no matter. For this is only commonwealth in whose politics we can ever partake. So what he's saying is it doesn't matter if it exists, it doesn't even matter if there will ever be a society like that. It's a mental exercise, but this is how society should be, ideally. So we'll go more into detail next time, but what is also interesting is in the same book, he kind of describes how this society can deteriorate and go through the steps of this deterioration. So what happens? How can this ideal society go wrong? What can go wrong? Well, first of all, he's saying the biggest danger comes from the spirited element, from the warriors. And he's saying one danger is those warriors, even though they may be like all very brave and good people, they may become too much caring about their honor and about their reputation amongst others. So note that even though you took away all their possessions, you took away their family, so they are just this kind of soldiers with nothing to attach them, you can't take away their honor. So they may start competing with each other over honor. Who is the bravest? Who is the bravest in battle? Who is the best warrior, and so on. And he's saying that is dangerous because it can lead to what he calls timocracy. Timocracy is the power of those who care about their honor and ambition and not the good of the people. And the rulers should care about the good of the people rather than their own honor. So even the best of us, when we start thinking about, oh, how other people see me, I want them to see me as a hero. I want them to see me as this fantastic ruler who is doing great things. That can in itself be the beginning of this downfall. And then if that happens, then next step to deteriorate is when these people start acquiring possessions, when they indeed start having money, and so then it can turn into oligarchy. Oligarchy is when you have wealthy people in charge. Again, they may be people who care about the society being just and everything, but they themselves are wealthy, so financial interest becomes more important for them than the good of the nation. And that is oligarchy or plutocracy. Now, it can go even lower, and that would be democracy. Democracy to Plato, and know that Plato is not a huge fan of democracy, is a step down. Well, why is he not a huge fan of democracy? Several reasons, by the way. One of them is note that his teacher, Socrates, was murdered by the people. There are 500 jurors who actually voted for him to be killed. The other reason is, remember, he is an aristocrat himself. He comes from the wealthy family. So for people like this, obviously democracy seemed like not an ideal type of rule. Another reason is, remember, in Athens they had direct democracy, and sometimes that can be pretty bad. So one of the interesting consequences was when they were trying to decide whether to have an expedition to attack Sicilian expedition. The presidents gathered in Athens, in Agora, the central market square, and listened to different speeches. And some people were saying, we should go and attack Sicily. That's a good idea. And other people were saying, no, we should not go there. And then they took a vote. So people who were advocating the attack of Sicily spoke very well, and they convinced everybody. And so citizens of Athens voted to do that, and it was a major disaster. In fact, it was one of the reasons Athens eventually lost the war. So this is kind of an example of what is problematic about direct democracy. What is problematic about direct democracy? Who should decide whether or not you should do some sort of military operation? Probably the generals. You would think the generals know a little bit better. Should you put it to a popular vote? Probably not. Probably not a good idea. And Plato does make a lot of point about that. Like, he's saying, well, suppose you are sick, right? And you need an operation. Would you go and ask a doctor, or would you put it to some sort of popular vote? Let's see if the residents of Las Vegas think I should have an operation. He's saying that would be stupid, wouldn't it? Because the doctor is an expert who knows about medicine. But how about residents of Las Vegas? Well, they do their own things, but they are not medical experts, so they should not have any say in that. So according to Plato, ruling a state also is something which requires special skill. And that's kind of why we don't have direct democracy in this country too. Note that we do not have popular vote on every single question. We select people, and these people represent us. That's why it's representative democracy. And these people are supposed to be experts in how government works. We are not experts in how government works. So our participation in democracy is just to select who is making these decisions. But having a direct democracy is obviously problematic, because you may get this situation when people just vote for something and it's really not a good idea, but people voted. So what can you do? So democracy, according to Plato, is a step down, because that basically means everybody who calls himself people's friend would do whatever they feel people will like, but that not necessarily will benefit the city. However, there's a step down even from that. He thought the lowest one is tyranny. And if you have democracy, you may eventually fall as low as tyranny, because tyrants, obviously that's like where he thinks democracy will lead. And it did lead to this way in Athens. Again, why? Well, because in democracy things start falling apart. When people pull here and pull there, and you can again see a little bit of that happening in this country today, when people are starting to say, well, we elect Democrats, they undo what Republicans did. We elect Republicans, they undo what Democrats did. So what's the solution? Well, maybe we should have one strong leader who will be neither Democrat nor Republican, and he will decide everything. That's what tyranny is. This is when you give up democracy and say, okay, let's have one person decide everything. There's obviously a temptation of that. And it actually did happen in Athens too for a brief period of time. Anyway, we actually kind of out of time for this last discussion, but hopefully you can see that it does raise some interesting issues. We'll go deeper into his philosophy on Wednesday and see he actually comes up with very interesting ideas about this whole thing. We will go and try to talk about them and so on next time, but for now I guess we're all out of time. So anyway, that's all we have time for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please read the chapter, because if you still didn't read it, there's a lot of interesting stuff there, and it will help you to understand what I'm talking about. Okay, so otherwise I'll see you on Wednesday.